Do good work is not a label, but a way of living. It is the constant and diligent effort to achieve a new level of excellence in one's own life. It is the hidden inner beauty behind the struggle to achieve excellence. It's not perfect, but imperfect. It is the effort, discipline, and focus that often goes unnoticed. The goal of Do Good Work is to highlight that drive. The guests I have on this show emulate this drive in their own special way. You'll be able to apply new ideas into your own life by learning from them. We will also have one-on-one episodes with me where we'll dive into my own experience with entrepreneurship and leadership. Every episode is designed to provide you with ideas that you can apply and grow in excellence in all areas of your life, business, and career.
Today on the show, we have Omar Morales. Omar is the Director of Project Management at Advano, as well as the founder of the Omar Project, a website dedicated to the art and science of project management. His career began at Shell, where he spent over a decade managing projects not just in the millions, but in the billions of dollars. From the United States to Singapore to Malaysia, project management has taken Omar all over the world. When he's not busy being a project director, he enjoys hiking, camping, and skiing with his wife Phoenix and their son Amias. Omar is currently based in New Orleans, and he's on the mission to help you apply project management principles in your life to remove chaos and get things done effortlessly. Sweet. Well, Omar, thank you for being on, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to chat with you today.
Omar, there's so much that we can talk about when it comes to project management, not only because one, I love the craft, the arts, the science behind it, but two, dude, startups need this. Like companies who are growing fast, companies who are growing in departments, if they're creating new task units or new departments within the organization, we need really solid project managers. And when you say that, we can talk about like, oh, the tools to use and whatever, but I think we just need really good leaders. So I'd love to get your insights when it comes to project management. What is it actually? And we can dive into like the implementation and measurement because I love the topic. But first of all, Omar, what's project management?
So project management is really, it's a science and an organizational strategy to try and execute ideas. It's the process of actually taking things from, hey, I had this really good idea, to getting it done and then getting a return on your investment. And what they've learned is like everyone's doing projects all the time. Like we have all our, and we're all project experts in our own right, where we like plan a birthday party, or we plan something, or we do these things. But what happens is when you get into organizations where there's a large group of people and you're doing more complex things, the things that we would do in our normal life that, it's just, I'll do it like this, or I'll wing it, or that doesn't work anymore. It gets too cluttered. It becomes chaotic. It becomes very difficult to see what's going on, how much you're spending. So the science behind project management is just how do you manage all this kind of chaos that's going on and actually make it predictable so that if you're doing a project that lasts a year, in a year, exactly how much you're going to spend, or you can at least say, I have this much of a probability of hitting that. And that in itself is where the value of, a really good project system comes into play.
Let's break that down because you definitely hit a lot of gold nuggets, and I want to make sure that this is extracted correctly because I don't want to overlook this. You tied back project management to an ROI. I'd love to learn how to measure that because you've managed projects that not just millions but billions of dollars. And that to me is extremely important because I know for startups, we might not be managing billions of dollars or even millions of dollars of projects, but it's important to get something done with a probability or forecast of completion with a completion date so that we can go ahead and execute that idea that would go into yielding a return on investment. So how do you actually attribute actions to a return?
Well, I think there's two ways of doing it. One is like a company that's actually making revenue. They would do their project budget and then they would have their time. So the like your cost or your value from that is going to come from what's the return once we turn on the project. Like if we're building a new facility and we start operating it, we're producing new cars. Okay, how much is that bringing us in? So that's one kind of method for established players that have been in the industry, and that one's an easier ROI to calculate.
Mhm.
But the other one for startups, especially pre-revenue startups, it's much more challenging to calculate this one, because
Mhm.
what it is like you having the project organization actually helps your cash flow burn, because it reduces it, and it
Mhm.
also helps you predict where your cash flow is going. So instead of
Mhm.
just having a whole bunch of things kind of just happening, and it's like, how are we doing this? Oh, well, it's John's doing this and this, and like, why are we over budget? Oh, well, we don't know. Like, you actually have a plan in place, and you're like, okay, we're going to implement these things, and this is our cash spend, and then you can talk to your investors and say, hey, this is what we're doing. Here's our cash flows for the next year, 2 years. This is our runway. This is where we're going, and these are the big things that we want to implement, and this is what's capex or not. There's the tool itself, and the reason it's so valuable is because it gives you outlooks on time, when things are going to happen, and then like how they're going to happen, and then what is successful, and all the other kind of like, I guess, indicators that mean you're moving in the right direction.
It's so important. I kind of, before we dive into like the steps by steps, or even the tacticals or strategies, I kind of want to look at like the principles at the fundamentals of a proper execution of project management, and focusing on that so that we can have a successful execution. So what are some of the principles that you want to make sure that you have undertaking a project or working within an organization?
If every project needs to have a couple of things to be successful. The first is it needs to have you've got to have like defining the scope of it,
Mm,
and that's actually not as easy as it seems. Like, it's easy to say, well, I want to do this, but what is this? Like, I want to build this
mm,
thing, but okay, you got to set parameters in place. And the reason you have to do that, and the reason this is now becomes a project, is because if you don't, everyone will have their own interpretation of what that high level goal is,
mm.
and they're going to go run with whatever that is. So setting that goal and then kind of saying, okay, well, this we want to do this, and that means X. These 10 things. That's what this means to us. That kind of sets your whole project off on a basis where then you can kind of like communicate with a whole bunch of people, or you got new hires coming in, they know what you're trying to do too. So like defining it well is actually something that's the first step that needs to happen, that oftentimes isn't, and that's where I've seen you can see a lot of issues there.
Yeah, because it's like defining what is done and what does it mean to have completion. Because that's,
Hmm.
like you mentioned, that's where a lot of waste can happen, not only like in the fact of the mal execution, but also not understanding what we're actually trying to get done.
Right. Yep.
So
Yep.
we let's say we set and understand this is the goal, is the outcome, the purpose. This is what completion looks like. Here are its attributes or its characteristics. Here's what it looks like for us. This is how we're going to measure it. What are some of the next best steps for us to take?
I mean, that's a great step in itself, and I think if you do that, you are halfway there to being successful. I think the next step is then, how do you communicate and manage all those things that would, like, what success means. And that means like having a system in place where then you're like, okay, I want this the one thing is going to be, these are my success criteria. And then it becomes like, how do I track those? How do I actually
Mm,
see them, so that way people like the leadership can see it, and then the people on the teams can see it, so that way they know what they're chasing, and they know whether they're going in the right direction or not. That is then the next step, is building those things out, which are, they're typically called like key performance indicators, but like they're just basically guideposts along the way to make sure you're not veering off what you initially said you were going to do.
that makes a lot of sense. And I think it's interesting to measure this because it's not just something that can be taken from a machine and implemented into a Google Sheets or zapped into Google Data Studio to figure out where we're at. I mean, obviously it can't, but it has to come in from a facilitator or like the project manager that has involvement with all the stakeholders in a project. How do you go about measuring, incremental milestones during a project?
So that's a good question. So projects in itself, they're designed, if you follow a project process, like something from a PMI or any of the like the European standard APMs, they have what they call stage gates in between their
Mm,
cycles, or their life cycles. So the first, like, is you identify the project, and then you kind of go into selecting it, and then you go into defining it, and then you go into executing it. And each of those stage gates, what you're supposed to do if you follow the process is you're supposed to have like a pause where you go to a little mini board. If it's a big project, you might go to the CEO and you'll say, hey, we want to invest this much money. Here's the due diligence we did. And here's why we think you should invest it. And that should be your kind of pausing scenario where you look at all your KPIs that you've already done and you say, have we been hitting them? Do we think we're going to hit what we're expecting to hit? And do we keep going? So there's always in this process, there's one big milestone that is really where you have to have a lot of scrutiny. And that's the one where you're about to fund the project and you're going to build it. And building it, like say it's a software product, right? We can idea phase it, we can wireframe it up. But once we get to actually paying for the software company, that's when like real money starts. We're really starting to burn real money. So maybe you take your pause right before then and you kind of have all these things, all these indicators leveled up like, hey, what did we say we were going to do? Now we have a real budget. We have an estimate from the vendor. These are the features we want and we'll have, and you'll have a really good sense of all that. And you can then say, do I want to go forward or not? So that is part of why project management is kind of like this mix between the science of managing this stuff. And then it's also got a lot of this organizational pull that, if you follow these processes, it can help you get to that location better with hopefully where you're doing it in a way that everyone's aligned on the vision that you have and how much you're going to spend and when you're going to finish.
That makes a lot of sense. And also like setting up the KPIs and in the definition phase, like how we're going to measure progress and when we're going to measure it. And I think like one of the factors, and that's not the biggest, but I know for me, when some of the clients that I'm working with, one of the largest factors is deadlines and hitting a deadline or missing a deadline. And what do you suggest when it comes to avoiding that issue and being proactive around missing deadlines, which happens?
Yeah, and it's going to happen. So it's just it's basically like planning how to handle it when it happens. So the first thing I do with deadlines is missing them. Everyone misses a deadline every once in a while, and that's okay sometimes. If you're noticing it's becoming like a habitual thing where it's not the person, it's the systems that's creating the issue, then that becomes more kind of a looking back at like, how are we actually managing this stuff? Like, do we actually have the right system set up in place? Like, are we creating our own bottlenecks? Or do we have a process that's kind of slowing down the throughput because we can't approve something fast enough because it's too much approvals? That's typically how I would manage that from like a deadline perspective. But the other way to manage a deadline, honestly, is there's a lot of accountability that happens when you just tell somebody, you meet in a group and actually ask somebody in a group, like, did you do this or not? Like that in itself, there's a natural, it's like camaraderie, people on a team want to get something done. And if John's in his group as an example, and he's like, well, I didn't finish it. And he does it three weeks in a row. Like, does he really want to go to that meeting and say, I haven't done anything? Like there's group accountability there. So a lot of the things that, project managers use is they'll use these group meetings to try and make sure people are being held accountable to whatever they committed to.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah. And then third thing is like, sometimes people need to be taught that it's okay to not like be so aggressive on their deadlines. Like if it's a person thing, where maybe they're just being too aggressive because they're like, oh, I think I'm going to get it knocked out in like 3 days. And it really always is taking them 5. Then that's like a little bit of coaching to be like, hey, dude, like, you can use, why don't we estimate something that's actually going to like be in the ballpark of what you're going to hit? Because that way I can plan around that. And that's part of a PM's role too, where they coach and they say, hey, let's get like an accurate number and let's not just try and hit something for the sake of hitting it.
It makes a lot of sense because I know that you discussed that one of the key characteristics for project management isn't just organizational skills, but it's also leadership, being able to do that. Can you elaborate like what your experience is in regards to identifying that we don't just need project managers, we need leaders?
Yeah, and this is kind of what I'm very passionate about, because I think you can learn these skill sets in project management fairly quickly. I mean, you can go through a project and kind of pick up, okay, like this is how I should be doing this according to this system, and this is how I do budgets or whatever, or this is how I do a Gantt chart, which is great because you'll need that. But if you don't have the leadership portion of it, it will be very difficult to lead the teams and the people towards that goal. So you have to have both the technical skills around it, but then you definitely need to have the leadership portion of it, because the definition of a PM or a leader is like you are pushing people or helping drive them towards the vision or the goal that they want to achieve or your organization wants to achieve. So you need to have the leadership, because it won't work without it, or it'll fall flat. It's super important.
That's really interesting. And that kind of like defeats or conquers like a notion that I've heard, that when you measure the success of a project manager, is that it should almost seem seamless, that a project just gets done on time, or that they're almost quote unquote invisible, making sure that everything happens. But in this case, it's not. It's being a forefront leader, making sure that everyone's taking their actions, almost even coaching the team, making sure, like you mentioned, the group meetings, and being able to come up with the best framework for a particular project or initiative. And that kind of gets like the next like question I had is, we can't just go into every single one, but I'm curious, how would you go about creating the right types of systems or frameworks to create like a great execution plan for a project?
Yeah, that is like the $1 million question, because there's a lot of projects that they seek that out. They start a new project and they're like, how do we make sure there's actually meetings when you have these $1 billion projects where they're like, how do we set up the project for success, and like, what is a framework we want to take a look at, and what is our vision, and how do we organize the teams and around communication. So there's a ton of work that goes into actually trying to just set up the project sometimes in a way that it would be successful, almost like setting up a department or organization. But I think the key thing is, for something like that, there are a lot of existing, either I would say go-bys, if you want to say that, or like tools that do help, where you can kind of set it up and run with it. Like, initiating a project process, or like stating what you want, or a basis of design document, those you could probably find examples of, and that would be a great place to start. That's kind of a key to get your scope frozen. What's your objective? What are your goals? Like, what are you trying to hit? Then like really being really firm, or understanding, what's your financials that you're trying to make with this? Like, why are you doing the project? Kind of getting all those challenges out of the way and getting those on paper. That's the first best step. And then the second thing is around the people. Like, if it's a big project, you want to have the right people in place, so that stuff's all going to work together. And that is just trying to get people organized in that way is that's actually a struggle.
That's mostly half the battle too, right?
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
Interesting. Well, let's flip to some of the fun stuff. So, can you tell us a little bit more about your experience from going from a very big company to a startup, and how that transition has gone, or what are some of the similarities or differences that you see when it comes to your role and the way that you're supporting projects?
Yeah. So, a big company, and I think any big company would be, you got a lot of resources, you have a lot of expertise within the company, so it's like you can always reach out to somebody. I think definitely, like, when you're in a startup, you're much more scrappy. You're kind of like having to figure it out on your own, or you're typically kind of like under resourced, which means you're trying to find things to do things in a way that's, more efficient, more optimized. It does, and I will say this, like, it forces you and forces anybody to really kind of think and be creative and do things outside the box. And what that means is, like, for a project, is a lot of organizations have very strict project processes where it's like, you will follow this, and then you will follow that, and then you got to submit this document, and then this one, and this is the process. And they do that because they don't want to have bad projects. So it's like a whole reason for it. But at startups, what's awesome is, like, you can create that, or you can say, I want to use this part of it, but I don't want to use this part. And that becomes like the way the whole company executes projects. So you can move much faster in how you execute, what you do, like what levels of approval are needed, and all that stuff, which I think is a huge competitive advantage. And I think I think startups can move very quickly in projects to where, it's kind of like pushing the boundaries of how fast you can go.
That's incredible too, and being able to measure that velocity. I think for a lot of our non-technical founders or listeners and audience, like what are some of the characteristics to look at when they're hiring for project management so that they can make sure that they have someone that not only supports them in their growth and it's not even pre-revenue startups, like the startups that are either early stage or mid stage and they're being successful, bring in the right talent. What would you suggest to look for?
Yeah, so I would always say this is that you're gonna have to have somebody that's good with people
Mm.
because I mean when I got into the project, somebody told me it's like herding cats, and sometimes, and I didn't understand what that meant initially, but I understand where they're coming from. It's just you're talking to a lot of people all the time. You're like the central stakeholder. So if you have a project and there's 7 key people that are doing stuff, you're always checking in with them to see like what's going on, how's it going, if it's delayed, why is it delayed. Sometimes you have to encourage people to go faster. Sometimes you got to push. Sometimes you got to hold people accountable. You have to be really good with dealing with a lot of different people because you're going to have to do that as part of your job. So if you get somebody who comes in and they're like, I don't like dealing with people, I don't like communication, I don't like pushing people, like they're not going to be the dude or the person for you because that's like 60, that's half the job. And they have to
Wow.
be able to also lead these teams because eventually if you got a great project manager, you want to be able to just give it to them. The whole reason you're hiring a project manager is because you don't want to be the person executing it. You want somebody else to execute it, tell you how much it's going to cost, when it's going to be done, and be accurate. So that person needs to be able to lead these teams and members to be able to do that. And they don't necessarily have to have all, project management as a skill and a technical skill. There's a ton of stuff in it. You don't need all of the technical skills. You can hire that out sometimes. You can outsource it. What you really need is somebody who can bring the teams together, drive them to a common vision, and understand how all the pieces and like the schedules play together with the costing and how forecasting works. And then they should have some sort of understanding of the technical, or at least be able to like pick it up, whatever the scope of the projects are, so that way they can kind of understand the big picture.
That's huge. It's like almost like the essential glue of teams
Yeah,
in
they
different
can be a
departments.
huge asset. I mean, if you hire somebody who's good, they will accelerate your execution and your delivery of whatever you're doing.
That's incredible. That's awesome. Well, Omar, tell us what are some of the exciting projects that you're working on?
Yeah, so I have a couple of ones coming up. So I founder of the Omar project and also engineeringleadershipacademy.com. And one of the things I'm rolling out is a course for engineers and really technical people where they may have felt stuck in their careers. They may have felt like they've been overlooked for promotions because they've been very focused on the technical and they've branded that in themselves for a number of years.
Yeah.
This is going to push them out into how do I get from the technical side into more branding as a leader. And the reason that
Mm.
I'm doing this is going to be part of a whole series for project management. But like we talked about, leadership and project management is so important that you really need to nail that portion of it down to then to really be a great and excellent project manager.
Interesting. And that's extremely important going back to the technical skills are the cornerstone of what you do, but it's also bringing it back to how do you associate to other people? How do you like see yourself with other people, but also how do you work with other people and making sure that, you know, because at the end of the day, we're working with others to make sure things get done or we execute and move forward in a certain perspective. That's interesting. Well, Omar, for all of our guests out there, what's the best place for people to go to thank you for this episode and reach out to you for to learn more about you?
Yeah, they can go at Twitter at Omar at the Omar Project. They can reach me at my website, which is theomarproject.com, or LinkedIn is also a great place to reach me at Omar
Awesome.
Morales. Yep.
And I'll put those links also on the show notes just to make it easier for people to reach out. Omar, thank you again for being on.
Appreciate it. Thank you.